Hello, everyone. If you are expecting to be attending the session on strengthening funder partnerships and collaborations, congratulations, you are in the right place. I'm Tim Hanstad, the CEO of the Chandler Foundation, and I am your moderator today, coming to you from Seattle, the United States. We have an absolutely terrific panel, and we're going to get to them in a moment. And we're also going to get to you, the audience, because we want you to get engaged in this working session. But first, let me start with a confession, because my understanding is that moderators are typically expected to be balanced and unbiased. But I have to confess that I am not agnostic on the importance of collaboration and philanthropy. I do have a bias. My experience, which includes only 3 years working in philanthropy, but 30 years as a global nonprofit leader that depended in significant part on philanthropy, that experience leads me to believe that if you're a philanthropist who hopes to tackle pressing problems and tackle them effectively, then collaboration is essential to success. Collaboration offers a number of benefits over going it alone, but it's not easy. And if it were, and particularly given the benefits, which we're going to explore here today, more philanthropists would be doing more of their work through donor-to-donor collaboration. Now, fortunately, we are seeing an uptick in donor-to-donor collaboration. Again, you'll hear more about that later, but it's from a very low baseline. Today, most philanthropists do most of their work in go-it-alone mode. Why? What are the advantages and disadvantages of donor-to-donor collaboration? What are the different types of collaborations out there and what are the trends? And perhaps most importantly, for those interested in seeking more collaboration, how can it be best accomplished? Is it possible for funders to give up their appetite for control or for attribution to more effectively collaborate? Well, we're going to explore those questions today and with our panel and also with you, the audience. And here's how we're going to proceed. We're going to start with some poll questions for you in the audience. We're then going to move to a discussion with our panelists. And while that discussion is going on, we're going to give you all an opportunity to engage in a couple of ways, if you want to. First, you will have an opportunity to answer in writing on a shared community whiteboard some questions on the topic. So for those of you who are more adept at multitasking, you will have that opportunity. If you don't want to do it, you don't have to. This would be using a tool called Easy Retro, and we're going to share that link in the chat shortly. Second, after the panel discussion, we're going to have a Q&A session with the panelists, and during that discussion, during the discussion, I want you all to be free to submit your questions in the chat. We're going to follow the Q&A session with another poll question for you in the audience before we move to closing remarks from the panelists. So, speaking of the panelists, allow me to very briefly introduce them. Their breadth and depth of experience on this topic is more than I have time to describe, but you can access their LinkedIn profiles, and I encourage you to do so. So first, we have Neera Nundy, co-founder and partner at Dasra India. For those of you who are not already aware of Dasra, I encourage you to become so. They are an India-based and a leading organization in facilitating collaborations between and among funders, as well as collaborations involving social purpose organizations, corporations, and government. So Neera, in 60 seconds, what else do you want the audience to know about you or your work? And how would you initially frame your perspective in today's topic in 2 sentences or less?
Oh gosh, I'm so glad I'm in your hands, Tim, throughout this. But I would love to highlight the fact that a lot of what Dasra has been focused on is the social purpose organization, as you said, and the NGO, and really what is it that they need to be successful in their work. What I'd love to focus on through this conversation is the importance of partnerships, trust-based networks, just how do we have a longer term view? And most importantly, how do we place the community at the center and create space for the most vulnerable?
Great. Well done. And next we have Anu Singh from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Anu is a member of the Philanthropic Partnerships team at the Gates Foundation and is their lead on philanthropic collaborative funds. And of course, you all know of the Gates Foundation, but you may not be aware of the great, mostly behind the scenes work of their Philanthropic Partnerships team. So Anu, same question, 60 seconds. What else do you want the audience to know about you or your work? And how would you initially frame your perspective on today's topic?
Thanks, Tim. Yeah, so I hope to drive our work to explore how we can unlock philanthropy at scale for social impact. So we know that many philanthropists have bold ambitions, but in many cases, the pace and scale of their giving just doesn't match their vision. And we think collaborative funds are a unique vehicle in that regard. And in terms of framing my perspective for today's discussion, I think the African proverb is quite fitting today, and that is, if you want to go quickly, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together.
Perfect. Perfect. And last but not least, we have Olivia Leland. Olivia is the founder and CEO, excuse me, of Co-Impact, a global philanthropic collaborative focusing on systems change. And as the founding leader for this pioneering funder collaborative, Olivia, like our other panelists, has much to offer on our topic today. Olivia also was previously a founding director of the Giving Pledge. So Olivia, same prompt.
Well, thanks, Tim, and it's great to be with you and Anu and Neera and all of you. So what to add quickly, I will say that about Co-Impact, we are, as I mentioned, focused on just and inclusive systems change. We launched back in 2017, and we support partners that are based in the Global South and that are working to transform health, education, and economic systems for millions of people. We're currently in the process of developing our second 10-year fund, and that is focusing on advancing gender equality and women's leadership. And I would also just say that collaboration is at the core of everything that we do, both in terms of bringing funders together and also with our approach, which really seeks to center the partners that we're supporting. So our program partners, we very much support coalitions and collaborations there as well. So what would I add for today? I think really collaboration is hugely important, has huge benefits, and effectively is a means to an end. So in itself, I would say what probably matters most is the how and the what of collaboration.
Great. Thanks, Olivia. And we're going to get to that how and what in the discussion, I'm sure in the questions as well. But before I turn back to the panel with my questions, as I promised, we have a couple of poll questions for you in the audience. So I think you should be seeing the first question coming up. Are we seeing it? Okay, maybe it's not coming up. Okay, I think. Okay, it's on. So the first question is, your funding institution involved in any formal collaborations with other funders? And if so, what kinds? Check all that apply. So I'll give you 15, 20 seconds to answer it. Okay. So I'm not seeing the poll results yet. A few seconds more for you to answer, and then we'll look at them together. Okay, I'm still not seeing the answers on our platform. for you in the audience, the speakers are accessing this through a different platform, so we're not seeing exactly what you're seeing. But oh, it hasn't closed yet. Okay, so we're gonna move forward. I guess the answers will be posted in a minute that I'll be able to see. The second question, our organizers, can I go ahead with the second question, or should we just move on to the panel discussion? Okay, let's move to the panel. I mentioned that we have a community whiteboard that for those of you who want to participate in this way as well, you have the option of, you'll see in the chat a link to this whiteboard. It's called the Easy Retro Board with some preloaded questions on it. And while the discussion is going on with our panel, you can submit your own answers to those questions or click on thumbs up for other people who have answered. So for those of you who aren't intimidated by this or want to try it, I think it's a good way to supplement your experience. So I encourage you to at least try it. But I'm going to go to our panelists, and I'm going to start with Anu. Anu, your team at the Gates Foundation has been looking at the whole ecosystem of funder collaboratives. And I know you recently commissioned some research on this. Could you share some of the findings from that research? What are some of the trends you are seeing?
Yeah, happy to. So we're extremely eager about the potential for collaborative funds to accelerate the progress the world is making on a wide range of issues, from reducing poverty to combating climate change to improving global health. We're convinced these types of funds can unlock significantly greater giving by high net worth donors to reduce social inequities. And the data, in my mind, backs it up. So as you mentioned, we recently partnered with Bridgespan to conduct a survey of about 200 collaborative philanthropic funds, mostly in the US, to get a more comprehensive understanding of the landscape. I want to quickly share how we defined collaborative funds too. So for this research, we defined it as entities that either pool or channel resources from donors to grantees and nonprofits. So the findings of this research will be published in the fall for everyone to see. I did share a pre-read and advance this panel with the symposium, so I imagine you all can access that through the website. Given this research hasn't been published openly yet, I'd ask not to broadly distribute the material, but please take a look and reach out with any questions. But getting into the details a little bit more, so the survey found that the ecosystem of collaborative funds has experienced significant growth over the past 5 years. The number of funds has grown quickly. Of the nearly 100 funds that completed the survey, about 90% were founded since 2000 and more than 50 since 2015. The other thing we're seeing is that many funds are giving at significant scale. So those that grant over $50 million per year has grown from 8 organizations in 2017 to about 20 funds today. We're also seeing a wide diversity of causes supported, as well as different types of operating models and governance structures. Survey respondents also reported significant opportunities for growing their work, with leaders indicating they could direct up to 3 times more in philanthropic capital without significantly increasing their capacity if fundraising was not an issue. Based on our earlier analysis, this amount would be equivalent to a full 1/3 of ultra high net worth giving. And then lastly, the large-scale philanthropy movement is putting equity at the forefront. The majority of funds had reported an intentional focus on racial equity, with about 42% citing racial equity as their core work and 44% indicating that they intentionally incorporate racial equity. Likewise, 29% of funds are focused on gender equity as their core work, and 38% intentionally incorporate gender equity. Respondents also share that 73% of fund leaders are women and 49% are BIPOC leaders. So to round it out, I'd say the field of collaborative funds has really morphed over the years, and it's been really interesting to watch. That's also to say I'm super eager with how the field's going to continue to evolve. So it's a really great time to get involved and learn more about collaborative funds.
Great, thanks for going over those findings. And as Anu said, we're gonna be sharing a document on the symposium platform. If it's not on there already, it will be on there soon, which will include those and a number of other resources that our panelists have suggested. I now, just to go back to the poll question, I'm now seeing the results. So just to summarize them, on the question of, is your funding institution involved in any formal collaborations? So 28% no, 38% yes. Yes as a participant in a pre-existing collaboration, 21%, and yes as part of a pooled fund, 10%. So that's of interest. So 10% as part of a pool fund. And in terms of the most important reasons you've participated in funder collaborations or considering participating, to increase impact, by far the leading answer, 63%, and then learning at 15%, economies of scale on granting, sourcing, vetting, reporting, 11%. Interesting, quite interesting. Let me move to you, Olivia. You lead Co-Impact. You clearly believe in the benefits of collaboration. I'd like to hear more about why you believe in it from what you've seen in the ground in your experience. What do you see as the benefits? And if you could maybe respond to the responses here on what people expect to see as the benefits and how that aligns or doesn't align with kind of your experience with other funders.
Sure. I mean, I think what certainly brought me to this is what seems like many of you named, which is basically that it's all about what impact you can have through collaborating. When I initially started talking to people about the idea for Co-Impact, and which came from discussions with many social change leaders, it was really, we didn't lead with the collaboration within philanthropy point. It was really about the change that philanthropy can support, specifically really looking at systems and why that's important from a justice perspective. And I think as we started digging into how do you actually really support systems change in an effective way, it comes down to being able to do that in collaboration. So some of what you talked about at the outset, Tim, of being able to come together and to be aligned in terms of, rather than kind of pulling the partners apart with different perspectives from funders, but actually really kind of bringing that aligned perspective. And also, I mean, it's interesting that nobody here actually said that by being able to aggregate funding, that's a piece, but I think that's probably because that's a means to the impact, right? So in a sense, that's not the end goal, but actually by being able to come together and actually pool funding, that can actually really help too. So I think the increased impact really comes from both the means of knowing what is actually the collaboration about and what's the approach that the fund or funders are taking, and then also the pooling and the leverage potential that comes alongside that as well. And then ultimately, I mean, I think I originally also came to this thinking, if as funders often the conversation is around, wouldn't it be great if all the partners were to collaborate? And in many ways, really what's also then, I mean, it's kind of obvious that it should flow from that also funders should be collaborating as well in order to sort of see this kind of change that we all want to see.
Great, and you've mentioned the topic of systems change. Can you say a bit more about that? Kind of maybe define it. How is a systems change approach different from a non-systems change approach, and why might Might collaboration among funders be even more important if you are seeking a systems change approach?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, basically, it's about seeing change that happens at the level of government system or market system that actually really is about multiple actors coming together to drive that change. So from a funder perspective, it means supporting an ecosystem of actors, sometimes rather than necessarily funding specific organizations, or if those specific organizations are really then partnering with others. And so again, it comes down to if the scale of the impact and the complexity of the impact such that it actually helps to have multiple partners coming together to actually support the work. And so that's actually what drove us in this, was that I kept hearing from social change leaders that really what they were, what ultimately what they'd like to see from philanthropy is actually support that really is at the systems level. And yet oftentimes be asking, so how is your organization going to scale, or how can we just support what your organization is trying to do, rather than how can you actually envision what the impact that happens really at the systems level, which goes beyond that. And so wouldn't it be great if you actually had funders coming together that said, how do we actually support this kind of systems level change in a way that lasts, and in a way that comes back to some of what Neera talked about at the beginning, which is really centering communities and partners in this work, which I think also is facilitated, which I'm sure we'll come to, by collaboration in philanthropy, so that really it helps to make funders then just be sort of one seat at the table rather than the ones really trying to drive the change, because as we know, that's not what ultimately really will drive the kind of impact that we're talking about.
Thanks, Olivia. And speaking of Neera, I'll move to you. So Dasra manages multiple donor collaborations. You've also created several resources for donors on why and how to collaborate, which also are going to be shared on the symposium platform. But drawing upon that experience, and what have you learned about the advantages of collaborations and the challenges of donor collaborations? Because we haven't talked as much about the challenge side.
Thanks, Tim. I was actually just listening to Anu sharing the Bridgespan studies and what's emerged as trends, and I think I'm struck by, so Dasra is focused on India. And it's a big enough country that if we could actually collaborate here, there's lots of problems to solve at scale. But I think the collaborative landscape is different, right? So even if we had hundreds of millions of dollars that were pooled, you can't ignore the fact that the NGO capacity for absorption is still a challenge. And that you can collaborate at the funder level, but if you don't collaborate, all the way through to the ground in the community, then you can't achieve the systems change actually that Olivia is speaking to. And in India, the systems change really is anchored around how do you engage government and how do you bring sort of collaborative action to the policy level. And so I think it's a bit different here, and there's still a lot of hesitance for local funds to pool. So you're seeing quite a lot of Indian funders and families want to implement themselves. And so the challenge is really, how do you convince funders to give up control to some extent and come into this pooling mechanism? About 10 years ago, we started giving circles as an initial phase of what collaboratives could look like. And this was more individual funding coming in. And that was a bit easier because people were experimenting with their sort of personal funds. I think what's challenging here in the collaborative funds, let's say that we're managing for adolescents or in urban sanitation and now child protection, is the power dynamic of pooling institutional funds, I don't think can be underestimated. So although there's a lot to be said of the leverage and the quantum, there's a certain power that gets concentrated even more amongst funders. So I think really focusing on governance mechanisms, how are we making this far more participatory? I think there's a lot of learning that we need to be able to do that. Otherwise, you're just exacerbating the same challenge we've had. It's just the donor and the funders being called collaborative. So, I think starting to encourage a better definition of collaboration, right? Is it pooled funds to resource nonprofits? I think it's a lot more than that. And all the way going down, and stop me, Tim, because I could probably go on, is just building on Olivia saying, and I would completely agree, that the power of the collaborative is really on having the impact. And so are we holding collaboratives accountable to that impact? I'm not sure we are. And so we hold it at a disaggregated to each nonprofit, are you achieving X, Y, Z? But to really achieve the systems change, you need to start thinking about aggregate impact and how are we really looking at that. So I think that's a whole journey. We're on a journey of collaboratives, some of us perhaps behind, maybe where the West is. But yeah, that's my little bit of a thoughts.
Great. Well, just a follow-up question to you, Neera, because you touched upon the challenges of governance, the challenges of accountability. And I know that Dasra has been looking at, and as I mentioned earlier, has created some resources about helping donors with this. What have you seen as key factors to success when you have had successful collaboratives, and particularly those involving institutional funders?
So I think there's two things, and then I'm happy to hand over. But I think the most important is clarity in outcomes, and it sounds very easy and straightforward, but if we can be clear on outcomes, but even sort of intermediate, what in both the short term and the long term is the collaborative really seeking to achieve, and framing that in a very tangible way that builds that sort of accountability, but it also builds a common agenda. And so, for example, in our adolescence collaborative, we have 4 outcomes that are focused on, age of child marriage, delaying pregnancy, keeping girls in school, and sort of increasing agency and employability. And that inherently breaks down certain silos and allows for different kinds of money to come in. So the other amazing thing about collaboratives to be able to achieve the systems change is you break down those barriers of like education fund or a health fund into something that can be far more holistic, but you anchor it around these particular, outcomes, I think is perhaps the most important and enabling factor. The second thing, which, sounds like a bit of a shout out to Dasra, but I don't mean it in this way, is there's a really important aspect around design, management, and facilitation of collaboratives. When you have the facilitation, you can look at the power redistribution of sorts, right? You can bring elements of neutrality to it. So the importance of having organizations be backbones for these collaboratives that helps to balance the funder dynamic and then finally the impact you're trying to achieve and engage ranges of stakeholders. I think there's growing importance for the ecosystem to have more and more of these kinds of players be strengthened and therefore play that sort of backbone role.
Olivia and Anu, I'm going to come to you next with this same question. What have you seen as kind of success factors? Where you have seen success, what's key to it? And there may be several things, but choose 1 or 2 or 3. Olivia,
Yeah,
can go
I guess.
first. Oh, go ahead, Anu. Go ahead.
Yeah. Before I even get to that, I just also want to address the great point Neera brought up about collaboration, how it's much more than just pooled capital, right? If you just look at that as an index, we're not going to get far. We'll move money, but in terms of impact, you're not going to get what you need. Collaboration is not black and white. It's highly nuanced, and taking into account all the different stakeholders that come together, removing your biases and seeing what really needs to get done, I think is the beauty of collaboration. And, I was looking at the polls here and seeing the challenges in terms of what folks have put and time and alignment and all those things. And you have to put that work in, and you have to put the time in. And if you're unable to put the time in, I challenge donors or funders to ask themselves why. Why is that a problem? Why do we have to move so fast? And really ask yourself those questions. And I think you'll learn just not a lot about collaboration, but more about your approach towards it. I think there's a lot of these conversations you have to have with yourself in terms of coming together collectively and being impactful. But in terms of success factors, there's a lot that in terms of, I think, institutional funders look at. We love the metrics, we love the data, we love the insights, we love, those cold hard numbers. But there's a lot more in terms of success indicators that I think that are surrounded around conversations, folks who are on the ground, their experience. What are they gaining from this? That, versus I think sometimes we're over-indexed on the quantitative factors and not always taking into consideration the qualitative factors. And so in my mind, in terms of success indicators, I think we have to start balancing both out and start learning more about the experience on the ground and how folks are, relating to that, and how, as funders, what we can do to make a difference.
Great, thanks, Anna. Great points. Olivia, to you on success factors.
Yeah. So I agree with everything that's been said. So I'll add a few. I think, and this sort of it's related to Neera's point on the clarity of outcomes and what it is we're trying to do. But I think also in that is the clarity of approach, and actually really, describing everything from the specifics of how you go about, selecting organizations or identifying basically everything from that is related to the collaborative. So I think, for example, we actually wrote up, which I'll post on the resources afterwards, a handbook which we actually wrote with our program partners as input, as to everything that describes how we go about the work of the collaborative, because I think that's also really important, just so that there's understanding across all and agreement as well. And we actually went back and forth as to whether that would actually be a useful thing to do, but felt like it was important to get alignment and also to use it as a method to get input on what it is that we do. So I think that's the first thing. And also we're actually currently writing something up which is more on kind of what are at its core, what are the things that are most important about what co-impact stands for? So everything from the focus on systems to really centering our program partners, to recognizing that it really is about giving our partners kind of space to have that coherence and not us kind of, suggesting different pieces. So that comes back again to the trust. And so being able to articulate those so that then there can be alignment, both in terms of within our team, and then crucially with the donors and other partners, I think is really important. I'll just quickly speak to two others. One, which is, I think, Tim, we worked on this together, but on the importance of actually clarifying what values underpin the collaborative, both in terms of with the program partners as well as with funding partners and others, I think is really important. So we went through that process, and I think it's also good to continually kind of revisit it, make sure that we're actually living up to them. But for example, one of ours is really about having a beginner's mind and recognizing that we're continually learning, and making sure that we really are doing that. And I think it's helpful to have that as an underpinning across the collaborative as well. And then finally, and Neera, you mentioned this briefly too, but I think on the I think recognizing and acknowledging and challenging some of the power dynamics inherent in both within the collaborative as well as just within philanthropy, I think is also an important part as we continue to see and build these collaboratives.
Tim, I just wanted to add something to what Olivia was saying, that I think sometimes we undermine the importance of, as it builds from, Olivia was saying, the need to articulate and emphasize values, right, of the collaboratives. And I think that's because we rely too much on people and relationships and some of the softer stuff for these collaboratives to be successful. But if we have these established values, right, and we're reinforcing how we are to behave as a collaborative and what is expected of us, then you don't leave it up to us as individuals. And I think there is a challenge, right, as professionals representing, you know, Gates Foundation, let's say, or a principal that actually represents philanthropy themselves. When we're all sitting at the table, there's a very complex dynamic that happens there. And so I do think some of what Olivia was speaking to is really important for us to equalize a little bit of what is difficult in building these collaboratives.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You mentioned earlier, Neera, the importance of being clear on outcomes, and which is essentially important, but being clear on values and how we behave with each other within a collaborative, I think also is key and is more often, I suspect, overlooked. It's specifically articulating those values and then referencing them when you see behavior within the collaborative that goes against the values. Anu, coming back to you, the Philanthropic Partnerships team, you guys are involved in lots of different collaborations. Could you, just to get a sense of what some of those collaboratives are, could you give some examples of collaboratives you participate in and maybe a bit on why?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the foundation, the Gates Foundation, partnerships are at the core of honestly our entire portfolio and all the work we do. We find great value in collaboration. A lot of the benefits which were mentioned before, which I won't go into, but one important use case that the foundation uses in terms of our investments in collaborative funds stems around the fact that we know that we are not experts in everything. We invest especially in those areas where our reach is limited. There are certain program strategies and efforts on the ground where we lean on collaborative funds, and those funds have stronger relationships with grantees, have better knowledge, have better experience, have more insight into possible solutions than we ever could. So there's this ability to kind of, you know, lean on others who know more than us. And I think that's important to call out. Some examples include our investments into Co-Impact's Gender Fund. We've supported Dasra's work in WASH, contraception, and COVID in India. We've worked with the End Fund and their work in neglected tropical diseases and getting medicines into Africa. We've invested into Blue Meridian Partners, who works in economic mobility in the US. And aside from even just actual investments into the funds themselves, you know, the Philanthropic Partnership team has also supported and invested in the infrastructure and capacity of these types of collaborative funds. You know, it's not easy to grow in this space, right? You know, if I mentioned earlier, there's 200 funds. Like, how do you find your space and your niche? And you know, in a world of funders, how do you find that grasp? And so some of them need support on the back end. And so my team has made seed investments into supporting funds to get them to grow, and with the whole goal and ideally for donors to then find those funds, build relationships, and become investors and become a part of the family of that fund. So there's a few ways we engage, you know, and I've learned quite a bit. I think one aspect too is, you know, I'll call it out as the Gates Foundation as a large funder. You know, you have to take the back seat in a lot of these investments and becoming a partner. We don't have any, you know, authority or more privilege than anyone else. We learn alongside all the others. And it's been such an amazing experience for myself personally. And I can probably say the same for a lot of our program teams, is that we've gotten access and knowledge to grantees that we didn't know existed, and had got the chance to play a part in creating impact in that way. So it's been a really great experience, and you know, I foresee us continuing to support collaborative funds.
Thank you. And on that point of taking a back seat, I want to come to you, Olivia, and ask a question about why you perceive that donors, at least many donors, are not getting involved in collaboratives, despite the benefits that we've talked about and the audience has pointed to. Most donors still have not joined collaboratives, haven't joined co-impact. And for many, it may be that the specific donor collaborative is not aligned with their giving priorities. That totally makes sense. But, and I don't want to press my perception on you, but I think we need to talk about control and attribution, because I at least perceive in our industry that the donors' appetite for control, and I'm overgeneralizing here, but it's certainly generally true, that the need for wanting to control the giving can be a stumbling block to joining others, because almost inherently you give up some of that control. You have to take that back seat. Do you agree with that? Do you see that? How much is that a problem? And have you seen donors who have had that obstacle and have gotten beyond it, maybe based on the experience of a collaborative?
Well, I'll start with the second part first, which is yes, absolutely. And I think what happens is once people actually see what the impact can be, that's where you can kind of get hooked on this. But I do think that yes, in a sense, it's about control, but I actually think it's something more than that too. I know I often say it's about control, but actually, in sort of unpacking it maybe one step further than that, I think those of us that have been working in philanthropy for a while, I feel like what we've generally done in terms of encouraging or advising philanthropists is to say, it would be good to come up with a strategy, and you need to come up with the issues that you want to focus on and a full strategy to go behind that. And the reality is, once you come up with kind of a very specific strategy, it's actually quite hard to then say, well, maybe there's something where it's actually based on the issue, or it's based on kind of partnering with others. Maybe there are ways that kind of you can link up these different strategies in a way that actually puts the partners at the center. And actually, in a way, it's some of the same barriers to a more trust-based approach to philanthropy that are the same sorts of things that keep people from collaborating, which is having more of an approach towards a full theory of change and strategy, which is not to say we shouldn't have that, but I think what also is a barrier is then saying, well, this is exactly it, and I only focus on this particular issue in this particular country, and this is where I am, and therefore it makes it harder to come together with things where maybe it's cross-issue, or where it's actually more focused on social justice more broadly, or where it's across different geographies, or where it's actually more of a trust-based approach, which is different from something. So I think it's a combination of those things, which is why I think coming back to the why of doing this, I think, and I know Anu, you'll probably speak to this in terms of, I know this is part of your approach, which is, of course, people can have a mix in what they do, right? Which is that basically that it doesn't mean to say that everything needs to be through collaboration. Some things can be specifically, where a funder has a particular interest, etc. I still would advocate for putting the partners at the center and really having that actually drive the approach. And I think then having some piece of it be in collaboration and then seeing if that works and if that's exciting. And generally what we've seen is that people who start working in that way, and actually I'd be really interested in this data, which is once people start doing more in collaboration and through collaborative philanthropy, they start doing more than that. And does that really increase? I think we don't have enough data yet just because it is a relatively newer field, but that'll be really interesting to see. And my assumption is that will be the case. And certainly we've seen that with some of our initial funders who have then also wanted to do more with the second fund. And I know, Neera, you've seen that with some of your partners too. So those are some thoughts, but ultimately I agree. I think it is control. I think it's more than that too.
Tim, can I just add to what Olivia was just talking about in terms of sort of control? I think we can't ignore the fact that it depends at which price point, if I may say that, a funder is coming in. So the higher the amount ends up being, feels like there's a lot more need for control, to know where that money's going, and feel that there's a greater responsibility because of that magnitude of funds that comes in. And the challenge is for us in this whole collaborative, it's the same large institutional funders that are populating all of the collaboratives. And then you have a sort of a long tail, let's say, of individuals or smaller corporate money. And so there's this middle that we really need to figure out, is how do you bring in philanthropists in that middle, where I don't think you will have some of these control issues. So it's a little bit like institutional funding in the financial services or in the financial sector. And I think Anu's partnership team does an amazing job in terms of building the collaboration. But to be very honest, the Gates Foundation has a lot of skill and expertise in sectors, right? So they're not agnostic when they're coming into a collaborative. They're coming with a tremendous amount of knowledge, data, and information. So you're not going to really be a neutral funder when you're like a private equity investor that knows how to do investments in certain sectors. So I think recognizing that certain funders will come in with that, and how do you design therefore around it? So I go back to the importance of the design, management, and facilitation, that these funds can be far more powerful if they're far more inclusive. So right now, sometimes we tend to say, okay, we'll take those top folks and come in, right? Rockefeller, Gates, Children Investment Fund, Omidyar, these are the same folks who travel around. But how are you going to create a construct that they are there, but is enabling and inclusive of others? I think we have to think about that in this sector a bit more to really transform and accelerate to have a lot more collaboratives.
If I can just respond to that, just really quick.
Yeah. Please jump in.
Fully agree with Neera saying, what points Neera is making, in the sense of you are seeing a lot of the same institutional funders, right? In some ways, I like to think that sometimes our funding can also help catalyze other funders who are a bit unsure to come in, and ideally we can help catalyze new funders. But that's one hypothesis through our investment, as well as a myriad of others. And there is this space where we aren't seeing a certain type of donor entering, and you see these as a great vehicle for those. And then just to speak on the expertise piece, yes, absolutely, the foundation has some amazing world experts, but a lot of these funds that we've joined do have checks and balances in place. If we're called on for expertise, a program officer will join, provide insights and knowledge, but then that isn't our ultimate decision. There's governance structures that allow for everyone to pass or agree on an investment or an approach or a strategy or a new model, get collective feedback, and then that fund themselves then will lean on their additional advisors or boards or experts they have to then make the best collective judgment for that fund. So I just haven't been in scenarios where our insights are overthrowing others. It is our insights to add to the collective benefit for the group. But I can imagine where funds don't have some sort of structure in place to make sure that these checks and balances are in order. Yeah, you can have an institutional donor come in and perhaps crowd out others, which would be unfortunate.
Yeah. Great point. I want to encourage the audience to submit questions. We've gotten some, so thanks to those of you who have submitted questions. We're going to get to those in just a minute. But I wanted to touch on one theme that hasn't come up yet. This symposium is about international philanthropy, and donor collaborations, of course, could involve donors just from the global north, but some of them involve donors both in the global north and global south. And I think you all probably have had experience with both of those. That is, global north plus global south collaborations. Could you just speak to, and I won't direct it to any specific person, what are those global north, global south power dynamics that at least global north funders ought to be aware of if they're considering entering collaborations that involve Global South donors that involve interventions in the Global South?
I mean, I can say maybe a little bit, and I think one of the challenges, especially if we place at the center the community and that we want to support as much as possible locally led organizations, I think there is an issue of culture and ways of working that the Global North has a lot of assumptions around. And so the investments and the nature of due diligence tend to take a certain form that there is a self-selection on the Global South side. And so you end up funding people who look and feel or speak English, right? So I do think there needs to be a greater sense of an appreciation, but that's a weak word. I'm not sure what the right word is, but if you're really going to stay true to addressing the issues of the most vulnerable by the most vulnerable, which is where I do believe philanthropy needs to go, but collaboratives need to go, then the Global North needs to adopt an approach that is sensitive and inviting and inclusive, right? It's kind of like this question on this equity relationship that showed up, that the audience is asking, where's the relationship of the NGO and the community-based organization really residing? I think that's where there are still significant barriers. When you look at Global North making the due diligence and making the investment decisions without the investment committee being very inclusive. So I think we can do a lot of changes to break this down and make it more effective, but I'd say these are some of the initial challenges.
Yeah, something I can speak to from my perspective is when we did this research with Bridgespan, so I kind of mentioned it, but I didn't get into the details of it, but the survey was sent to 200 collaboratives. Among those respondents, 85 of the 97 are based in the US. US was the most frequently referenced geographic focus area. And then, we had outside that mentions of in Asia, about 22 and in Africa, 21. So you're seeing that there's I'm not saying our research or work we did was completely inclusive of every single organization that, thinks of themselves as a collaborative fund, but, we casted a wide range, and you have to call the biases out of clearly the folks we've reached out to were based in the Global North and their work is in the Global South. And for me, there's a question of, how many out there are there homegrown global South collaborative funds where, they're housed in the Global South, work on issues in the Global South, work with donors who have a focus or from the Global South, this on the ground community-based approach. And that for me is a question and a gap I have. I don't have the data around that, but I do want to learn more. And I think it's a really relevant question, especially as we get funders who ask us, how can they best support funds based outside of the US? So I'm seeing this need and this question. And so, until there's more research done in this space, for me, it feels like a gap. And, we have great organizations like Dasra doing the great work in the region, but the question for me is more also broader and global in nature.
And I might just jump in. Sorry, I'm doing badly at jumping off mute. A few things I would mention. One, which is we're talking a lot about donors and program partners, and I actually just think that it's also really important as we talk about governance and governance models that they not just be donor models, right? So I think there are ways to address some of the questions of making sure that we are that ultimately this actually leads to more impact, and that actually we are listening to voices that aren't just donors and the program partners, but that we're also operating. So for example, with our gender fund, we want to make sure that there are feminist leaders that are from the Global South that are actually advising and engaging on the work and are actually part of the governance model. So I would say, I think just as we talk about collaboratives, I think that's also really important. And I think some of these questions around ensuring that we, that like, for example, for our team, we actually made the intentional choice that we actually are a global team, with both in the Global South and the Global North, that we have funders that are both from the Global South and the Global North. All of our program partners are local, so it's all locally led in the Global South. All of our focus is Global South. It's all locally led organizations that we support. For many of the things that we've just been discussing here in terms of the reasons for that, I do think I saw one other question here, which is also about the size of funding, and we actually have made a shift in that from our first fund. It tended to be at sort of more to kind of larger funding amounts. And what we found also from a systems lens, and especially with a focus on gender equality and also intersectional gender equality, we really want to make sure that we are, which has been a space that frankly has been dramatically underfunded. If we're talking about funding collaboratives being underfunded, I mean, really, this is a space which, despite obvious impact of the organizations and need, has received so little funding that as a result, some of the organizations just haven't actually gotten as much funding up to date, and therefore making sure that we also do provide support that is to different kinds of organizations at different amounts is, I think, one of the things I'm most excited about, which is something that we're actually going to do. But I completely agree with the point that we need to do more to understand how is it that actually, and this is a question I think not just for collaborators, but it's for philanthropy writ large, which is how do we make sure that we get the word out much more broadly, not just to the people that we otherwise know, and how, open calls in itself, they're not enough if you don't actually also look at questions of how do you get that out? How do you get the open call out? How do you make sure that even in translation that maybe you make it, and this is something we've been grappling with as well, which is that we actually do our open call in many languages, but then can we actually receive the applications in many languages, something we're working on. So those are some of the things I think, just as we get into kind of the details, that I think are really important as well.
Fantastic. Well, let's move to questions, and thank you to those in the audience who've submitted questions. First one that I'm going to ask here is to the point about how it's not just about pooled funds. Can you address the power of collaboratives that are working together but not pooling funds? Anybody want to tackle that one?
So our work in urban sanitation, which actually just has the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as a funder, it's not a pooled fund, but we actually work and bring partners in the WASH space together into an alliance called it's not a very sexy name, but the National Fecal Sludge and Septage Management Alliance. And there's about 40 partners brought into here, and we've been really working together, right, through task forces, and ultimately being able to really have a policy on fecal sludge management with the government. So it's a very powerful platform engaging with the government, with a combination of different kinds of organizations that are deep in the community, all the way to the World Bank to KPMG. And I'm not sure if this is, collaboration in the way, it's not in the way that at least Bridgespan defined it here, but there is something to be said of multi-stakeholders collaborating towards, in this case, policy action. I do think there is a role for more and more platforms like this, especially because the government, at least in India, is far more engaging and inviting to want to engage with platforms and have these kinds of consultations and not deal with, organizations or funders sort of one-to-one. I don't think this is unique to India, but it's just an example.
Great, thanks, Neera. There's a question here about audience member says the term partnership itself has taken on negative connotation among some NGOs and CBOs, that they don't feel power or equity in the relationship. How do we counter that perception or reality? Reality wasn't mentioned as part of the question, that I added that.
Happy to jump in on that, because I think it's, oh, sorry. I mean, I think ultimately it's about it's some of what we talked about at the beginning, which is actually naming it and naming what we're trying to do, and then continually measuring whether actually it really is working in the way that you're anticipating in terms of it being a true partnership. I think I'm reading this in terms of the negative connotation being basically between funders and NGOs and CBOs. And I think that's where, and it's true, I think sometimes we use the word partner loosely, and then there's still, unless we do some of what all of us have talked about here, which is actually naming some of the dynamics that are at play and actually really trying to figure out how to continually question and learn and say, what is it that we can do to try to actually counter the reality, not just the perception of a lack of equity, of a lack of balance in terms of whose voices are being heard, of when if we say that we're centering our partners and communities, and then we aren't actually doing that, what we're doing, then I think that's a problem. And so it really needs to be about how do we actually both name it and then continually push ourselves to say, how can we really be the partners that we intend to be? So I think that's a really important question.
There's a related question here about, while donor collaboratives can achieve great impact, what are the tangible ways that they can work more directly with locally led community-based organizations who may not be able to manage large grant amounts, but have capacity and focus to grow into far bigger roles if they have support? So tangible ways that collaboratives can not only tie into those community voices, but actually support those community-based organizations.
I can jump in on this one. So actually one of our investments specifically with the collaborative funds actually tackles this situation where they have a place-based approach where they work in these regional areas to effectively create the impact on the ground towards economic mobility. And with some of these NGOs that are more, some ways smaller, if you will, of their capacity, you have some of the folks from the collaborative funds working alongside these organizations, helping them think through their planning, their strategy, giving up their time, and in some ways seconding folks from the fund to partner and help them think through the strategy and their growth plan, and do it in an organic and systematical way versus dumping a whole bunch of money and saying hiring folks, because that that's not the solution in a lot of these situations. So you have these funds partnering with them on the ground to think through, how do we best grow and develop the next 1 to 5 years or whatever the approach is, and then as well as lean on that grantee or the organization to ask them, this region, this place, who are other partners that we should tap on and grow the community with. And so those organizations will then through their network advise of who those other organizations are, and from there you're able to really kind of build out this network in these regions and help them grow thematically through or systematically through their own growth trajectory.
Just maybe quickly to add on to that is I think absolutely, and I think in addition to doing so directly, as this is a key focus for us, actually in the gender fund as well, is both whether to do so directly and then also partnering with others. So I think part of the role by the nature of collaborative philanthropy, it's also about who else can you partner with in order to be able to provide the support. So I think that's a key piece in it, and so for us, we're actually looking at both ways to do that.
Honestly, Tim, I think it's also, just to Olivia and Anu's point, I think collaboratives need to have a shift in strategy away from or in addition to. It's not about funding large scale, right? It's not about just growing the fund and growing organizations. It's really rethinking how you take risk at component level, right? And at a component level, you can begin to take pieces of what's working with strong sort of M&E and begin to scale that through a number of different partners. So I think we need to do a better job of reimagining what systems change looks like at scale, from, you know, just pumping money into organizations to grow, to being far more curated and where you might take risk in locally led organizations for some very discrete pieces of work that they do, rather than growing the full end-to-end intervention. And we're seeing, I think, more of this kind of innovation and way of investing as well.
I mean, I think actually I think across most of the collaborative funds, that is the case. I mean, I think that would be an interesting thing to look at, because I totally agree, Neera, that that's important. And I also think even in the larger funds, actually doing both is generally the norm, I think, right? So both to be able to provide, because the reality is we also need to be able to provide larger, longer term funding, as well as you know, so sort of the full set, I think is key, and that's really what systems change is about. But I think that's, you know, I think it would be a mistake if we went from, you know, one to the other. But I do think across the collaborative funds, we actually see that mix, which I do think is important, and even within individual collaborative.
You just hear a lot more about big bets and not enough about what you know, the other side of what also needs to be done. I agree.
There's another question about risk in there, and about the question was, how well do donor collaboratives handle riskier opportunities? I mean, of course, there's a strong case, I think, to be made that philanthropic capital needs to be much riskier. And the observation of the person who asked this question, is their sense was that donor collaboratives have preferred situations where there's already some history of working at large scale and some history of success. So what can and should donor collaboratives be doing to address these riskier opportunities? Well, should they be, and how could they be? Because I could develop the hypothesis that if I'm a risk-averse philanthropist, that at least I'm going to fail. Better to fail together. Is that true? Do you see that?
I don't think that's true. So only from, it's a strong bias from the giving circles that we started about 10 years ago. I think that pooling funds de-risks in and of itself. And yes, perhaps when it's larger institutional funders, it feels like they're not taking a risk because they're funding, you know, organizations that have more proven models. But I think there is a landscape of pooled funding that does take more risks. So in our giving circles, we had 10 philanthropists who pool money. You know, out came from giving circles organizations, you know, that are Educate Girls, Magic Bus, you know, Akshay Patra, Sneha, Lend a Hand, all organizations that the Global North is, you know, now funding. So it goes back to, there's a role for this mezzanine funding that can actually take more risk. So we need to invest in unlocking, you know, more family philanthropy, if I may say that. So families that are, you know, in wealth or have had liquidity events, at least in India, this kind of giving, I think, is willing to take more risk. And that's where you could get that pooled bump up into taking and funding a lot more of these emerging organizations. But there do need to be collaboratives, I think, who establish themselves as, we are supporting emerging organizations. I think there is a gap there.
Yeah, just to add to that, I would say the philosophy at the Gates Foundation in terms of the capital that we invest with, risk is always in the equation, and it should be in the equation. It's not, and you know, we accept it. It's an expectation that a number of our investments will fail. Because if you think about how philanthropic capital and the market dynamics, right, the market opportunity for a lot of these NGOs and organizations isn't there. So in some ways, this capital has to be high risk and take on situations where there is a high chance of failure. And if I think about that and how we think about collaborative funds, then in my mind, you know, there should be appetite for collaborative funds to approach risky areas where, you know, sometimes your dollars don't have the outsized impact you want. However, was there learnings? Were there lessons? Were there relationships developed? There are other metrics that go into what success from that capital looks like, and the approach that need to be taken into account. But yeah, I would say my hand is up for risk. I'm also a highly risk tolerant person, so speaking for myself there.
And the one thing I might add is I think there's probably a difference between risk and organizations that aren't the sort of usual donor darlings as well, which I'm not sure that those two things are the same thing. Like, I think to some extent, what I think the question is about and what we're also talking about is let's make sure that we work to, yes, absolutely support the organizations that have been working at this and actually show impact, and also make sure that we really are also finding ones that may have been underfunded but have, you know, efforts that have been have had a huge amount of impact already. And if we actually could just provide more funding to them, it's actually not risky. It's actually more about making sure that we are, and it goes back to our earlier conversation about making sure that we get out the word far and wide about the nature of the potential for funding, so that way these collaboratives are reaching beyond. Because I think that's part of what the question is about, which I do think is also important. I also think that it's not just about early stage, right? I think to be honest, I mean, very little funding focuses on systems, partly because that actually is seen as being more risky, because it's not about scaling an organization, and it's about taking what we know is already effective, but actually really looking at, you know, leadership and partnership and supporting efforts that are coming together to do this work that really can have that kind of systemic impact. But at the same time, it's not about scaling it. And so that's where I think there is some risk inherent in that. And that's actually what's so exciting when you take collaboration that's actually about systems change. It's about saying, let's get behind you, right? Like, let's, as funders, come behind you and provide you with a kind of long-term, lasting support where you are driving it. We are there to support you over the long term with the funding that you need, and that might vary in terms of the amounts, right? And even actually in terms of the amount of time, but in such a way that the vision that you have for what you want to see in the system is actually possible. And I think that goes back to this question of outcomes too, which is, it's not about tracking every piece along the way. It's actually about working and saying, what are those kind of people level, system level outcomes that you want to see, organization level outcomes that you want to see? How do we get behind you to do that? Because the partners that we're supporting actually want to see these probably at least as much, probably more than the funders involved. And so our job is actually to provide that kind of support to get there. So I think those are some of the key things for us to think about as we approach some of these questions around who gets funded, what the risk is, et cetera, and what the role of the collaborative should be.
Great. Well, great conversation. We have to wrap up in a minute, but there's one other question here that we didn't get to that I want to at least give one of you 60 seconds on, and that is it relates to actually learning was mentioned in the last part of this discussion where we were talking about risk. So the question is, what is the need for research and evaluation and learning in this space? Are research institutes or universities seen as important program partners in these collaboratives? First one to the mic gets to answer it. Okay, Neera, go ahead.
Okay. I mean, absolutely, without a doubt, at least we've seen the need for research institutions, especially to be able to scale and to engage with the government on what's working and what's not, but also to, you know, replicate what's working. You need that. I think the challenge, I must say, in India are two things. The cost of this often isn't there. Second, the capability and capacities are still weak. So I think there's a lot to be done in this area, but without a doubt, the most important in this M, E, and L, I think, is actually the L, the learning, just fostering more of that and creating more codification and documentation of even what's not working. I think we all need to be able to do that and leverage academic institutions in collaboratives far more formally than we do. And I do think funding that comes in and gets pooled, allocating towards this kind of work is important. I would even go far, I know you said 60 seconds, but I think what we didn't talk about is the value of collaboratives in building, horizontal kinds of assets, right? That can be used by the sector and the ecosystem, whether it's technology platforms, ways of measurement and things. I think that would be a real contribution to the sector if we did that more as collaboratives.
Thanks, Neera. Okay, we've got a few minutes left, but I want to give each of you 60 seconds or less as we wrap up here. What are your kind of final thoughts? And I'm going to give you a prompt. Your final thoughts doesn't necessarily have to be this prompt, but consider using it. What advice do you have for those in the audience who are considering collaboratives on how they should approach it? So either answer that prompt or give your other final thoughts. Again, 60 seconds or less. Anu, you go first.
Yeah, I guess just to respond to your prompt, for those who are considering it, I think the first thing you can do is talk to someone who is a participant in a collaborative fund or a collaborative fund themselves to get the awareness. I'm a resource for folks if they want to reach out. I think my information was in the chat. So happy to talk about what I'm seeing and learning. And that's just my own perspective. But I think the more folks you talk to, the more insights you'll gain. And I think one other thing I'd just call out is that even the most experienced and thoughtful donors can sometimes pull grantees and organizations in opposite directions with different perspectives on strategy. So aligning around one joint vision can really be helpful in driving towards large-scale results and outsized impact. So there's really benefits to that approach. And I think the last thing I'll leave everyone with is that, based on this conversation, I hope everyone got a taste for collaborative funds and the value of collaboration. And I'm very bullish about how the sector will grow, and I hope to see this growth continue, globally. And in terms of the impact as well.
Thank you, Anu. Olivia?
I should really just say what Anu said. I love what Anu said. So I think I think the one thing I would just say is absolutely go out and find out what's out there. Look at I think some of what we talked about here in terms of what the collaboratives are about and how collaboratives go about the work. I think that's also interesting to look into. But I really do think go out and find out, talk to some people who are involved in them. And then I think thinking about having some portion of your philanthropy involved in collaboration in some way, I think is really worthwhile. So that would be the one thing I would say, and just exploring that and seeing if there are different ways to do that would be my 60 seconds and what I said.
Thanks, Olivia. So Neera, you get the last word.
Oh no. I agree with both Anu and Olivia. I mean, I think that it's fun. I think we sometimes take ourselves far too seriously in all of this social change, but it's so complex and you can get yourself down and it can be lonely. And so collaborating is fun. You find other people who are wanting to see the world in a way that you do. And so I would say come in by leaving, ego behind, but recognizing where we are in the power dynamic and actually having the courage to confront it. I think that's what collaboratives can really help us. If we enter in, collaboratives can be very powerful change agents.
Fantastic. Well, I know the audience will join me in thanking you, panelists. That was such a great discussion, and it was you gave us a lot to think about and a lot to chew on as we go forward and think about collaborations. So thank you, all of you. We will have, as was mentioned earlier, several resources on the conference platform. All of the panelists have suggested specific things, and we'll put those on the platform. So those will be available, I think, for 30 days after the conference, but don't wait that long. Jump on and get it if you want to dive into this in more detail. There's plenty of good resources, and you'll find them in one place on the platform. With that, we'll close. I want to thank the organizers, the Philanthropic Initiative and New England International Donors. Thanks for gathering us all around this conversation and so many other good conversations that that are going to be a part of these 3 days. Thank you to the organizers. And I think the next session starts at 40 minutes after the hour, or if you happen to be in India, it'll be 10 minutes after the hour. And if you are in India, you're up very late. But in about 12 minutes, your next session will start. So thank you everyone for participating, and have a happy day. Thank you. Bye-bye.